What exactly is affirmative action? Affirmative action is a quota system where the school sets aside a certain number of seats for each race. This means that regardless of your test scores or grades, you will be judged first and foremost based on your race. Only after that will merit come into play. What this in effect means is that you are only competing against those of the same race as you, and there are different standards for each group. According to a Students for Fair Admissions analysis of more than 160,000 applicants who applied for admission over 6 cycles from 2000 to 2015, Asian Americans scored higher than other racial groups on measures like test scores, but fared less well when it came to an assessment of their personality. Harvard consistently rated Asian American applicants lower than other races on traits like likability, kindness, and positive personality. How can one group be judged as not having a positive personality? Is this outright racism? Well, that's certainly the case, taking Harvard's admissions officer's words at face value. I think there's more here. Harvard is looking for an excuse to not admit as many Asians. They want to act as though every group is equal in their merits, when that is simply not the case. So they invent a fake category called personality and repeatedly rank Asians low in that category, while ranking blacks high, for example. This allows them to use the personality ranking to balance out the low test scores of blacks, while dinging the applications of Asians. It is significantly harder to get into elite colleges these days as an Asian American, simply because colleges set the bar so much higher for them compared to other groups. Is this fair? Absolutely not. Don't believe this is true? See for yourself. Harvard killed an internal 2013 report about its admissions policies, which states that they discriminate against Asian Americans. According to The Guardian, the report found that Asian Americans would comprise 43% of admissions if only academic qualifications were considered, and 26% when extracurricular activities and personal ratings were considered. Yet, at the same time the research was conducted, Asian Americans made up 19% of the share of admitted students. This is outrageous and should upset anyone who cares about fighting discrimination. It's just as hard to get into these elite colleges as a white person, as they're also discriminated against in favor of blacks. But of course, the left doesn't care about white discrimination because to them, that's okay. It's good, in fact. But why doesn't the left care about outright discrimination against Asians? It's odd. We haven't heard a peep out of the left about how egregious this is. The left claims to want to fight discrimination and claims to care about minority groups. However, this is nowhere to be seen in their actions. No leftists have come out in defense of Asian American students or in defense of anti-discrimination. Colleges like Harvard are operating based on the same kind of discrimination and stereotyping that was used to justify discriminating against Jewish applicants in the 1920s and 1930s. It's funny how only later in history do leftists look back at, let's say, discrimination against Jews and say, that was wrong, but never do they do anything to help those people at the time. That's why it's up to us, those of us who care about the truth, to speak up. Asian Americans and whites are heavily discriminated against. The reality is there isn't white privilege, but Black and Latino privilege. We're not just talking about discrimination that's under the radar. This is outright and measurable. And this is being practiced on a wide scale. This is a complete perversion of the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King's goal was for everyone to be judged as individuals, but that's far from what we're seeing now. So the left has perverted the meaning of anti-discrimination to now mean discrimination itself. Martin Luther King would be spinning in his grave if he saw this kind of judgment going on today. Harvard claims that abandoning race-conscious admissions would diminish the excellence of a Harvard education. The left wants proportional representation, which means that the percentage of students at the school reflects the percentage that group makes up in the country. However, with Asians overrepresented according to this standard at elite colleges, leftist gatekeepers see discrimination against them as justified. And the same goes with the workplace, specifically tech jobs. Why can't we celebrate the people who are the best in every field, regardless of skin color? The NBA is predominantly made up of Black athletes, and many of the US Olympians featured most prominently are Black as well. But does that mean we need to start acting as though more praise should be given to our athletes that aren't Black, since so many successful ones are Black? No, we can celebrate those who work hard and succeed, no matter their race. diversity of skin color supposedly creates excellence, according to Harvard, but true diversity would focus on diversity of thought, not diversity of skin color. Diversity of skin color doesn't guarantee diversity of thought, because not every white person thinks the same. Not every black person thinks the same. Individuals have their own thoughts. You would think this would be common sense, but common sense is hard to come by these days. Now let's look at advertising. Why is it that in commercials and ads it seems like there's always a white person, a black person, and a Hispanic person? Sometimes there's an Asian person, but it's more rare. Even whites, who make up the majority of the population in America, are proportionately featured less in ads compared to blacks, who make up a small percentage of the population, yet are featured on billboards, in commercials, in your inbox when you get a promotional email, and so on. I rarely open something promotional and see an Asian American featured. This shows the left's desperate attempt to put only blacks at the forefront, as if by them doing that they're supporting all minorities. But I want to look at the workplace because that's where this is most telling. Let's zoom in on Silicon Valley. An article in Quillette magazine reads, according to publicly available 2020 data from Facebook itself, Asians make up 44.5% of the company's total positions and 53.4% of what Facebook calls technical roles. Technical roles include both the hardcore software engineer roles that are almost exclusively Asian staffed and the softcore data scientist roles that tend to attract more white people. But Asians make up just 25.4% of what Facebook calls leadership positions. That represents a nearly 50% cut in terms of Asian employees who start in the company and move up to leadership. No other race exhibits the same low ratio. Black workers represent 3.9% of all roles at Facebook and 3.4% of leadership positions. Hispanic workers represent 6.3% of all roles and 4.3% of leadership. White people, 41% of all roles and 63% of leadership. This shows us that while leftist companies like Facebook claim to be about diversity and putting minorities in positions of leadership, they actually don't apply this principle when it comes to Asian Americans. They're more than happy to leave them doing the technical work while they promote blacks and Hispanics to leadership roles and use many of them for their photo ops to make it look like there are a lot of blacks and Hispanics in tech. This is virtue signaling at its finest. Facebook wants to take credit but doesn't deserve any of it. And this isn't just Facebook. Let's look at Google. Asian Americans represent 41.8% of Google's workforce, yet in Google's 2020 annual diversity report, Asian Americans are barely mentioned. Instead, the report comments on Google's increased representation for women globally and for Black plus and Latinx plus employees. We saw the largest increase in our hiring of Black plus technical employees that we have ever measured, claims Melanie Parker, Google's chief diversity officer. It's still a mystery what a Black plus person is. Clearly, Google only cares about championing the minorities they think are most worthy of public praise, mostly blacks, while having primarily Asians doing all the work behind the scenes. The bottom line is leftists think that promoting blacks gives them a get-out-of-jail-free card. They think that endears them to the leftist media and makes them seem like good people, when in reality, behind their rhetoric and photo ops, it isn't blacks who are doing most of the work, it's Asians. But the truth is, the leftist elites see Asians as too successful of a minority. It's not that leftists hate them, it's that Asians don't fit into their narrative that minorities are victims and are in dire need of their help to be lifted up. It's not a white savior complex, it's a liberal savior complex. Today, we're joined by Kenny Zhu. Kenny Zhu is a young commentator and activist and author of the book An Inconvenient Minority. So Kenny, why don't we start off with you telling us a little bit about your background? Not a lot of Asians are politically active or even interested or plugged into all of these issues. So tell me, how did you become interested in all of this?
Well, first of all, Danielle, thanks so much for having me. And for me, growing up, I grew up in a diverse community. I had white friends, Asian friends, black friends. And as much as the left would like to smear me as a person with implicit bias, I genuinely did not care what race people were. And in fact, race was not a real thought in my head until I started applying for college. And then I realized And it was an open secret in my Chinese American community that top schools like Harvard, Princeton, Yale, the schools that all of the Asian kids would want to attend, actually discriminate against Asian Americans. And, that was the first time when I realized, well, hey, this is something I can't control about myself. I can control how hard I study. I can control, what I do, but I can't control my race. And I thought that was wrong. It was unjust. But I also thought it wasn't that big of a deal because it's just a few spots at college admissions. But then when I actually got into college, and I went to Davidson College for math, actually, I realized that this ideology of putting one race in privileged and oppressed categories and then giving out preferences to people just based on race is not just at Harvard. It's all over America now. And it's in public schools, it's in corporations, it's in governments. Governments give preferential treatment to certain minorities over others. And I realized that if someone doesn't speak out about this, Asian Americans are not just going to be suppressed to admissions to Harvard, they're going to be suppressed everywhere in American society. And their dream of being a truly equal American citizen would be put in jeopardy. So I felt that I had to write my book, An Inconvenient Minority, and it's out today.
Wow, congratulations. Well, I want to ask you a little bit about affirmative action, which we discussed at the start of the show. The merit principle is where you judge an individual based on their merit, and the diversity principle is where you judge a group based on their diversity. And you try to make sure every group is present on the campus at roughly the percentage of their population. So either we go with the merit principle or the diversity principle. So tell us a little bit about the problems with the diversity principle.
So I believe having a racially diverse people is not a bad thing for sure, but the thing is when Harvard makes a class and they say they want to add more racial diversity, what that means is they want to add more less qualified candidates who happen to be of a certain race, Black or Hispanic. In order to do that, they have to actually reject candidates who are more qualified than them objectively. And predominantly, that means that those candidates are predominantly Asian American. Harvard's own Office of Institutional Research said that if Harvard did not discriminate against Asian Americans would make up 43% of Harvard's student body. Instead, they make up 18%. So there's not just a small penalty against Asian Americans, it's a huge penalty. And Asians have to score 440 points higher on the SAT to have the same chance of admission as a Black person. And so what happens is when you try to apply the diversity principle too far, it comes in tension with this idea of admitting the best qualified candidates bar none. And that idea is the foundation of meritocracy. That idea is the foundation of America's culture of excellence. So those are some things that I cover in my book, and I'm excited to discuss.
Yeah. The Biden administration has withdrawn the discrimination case at Yale, but there's still an ongoing case with Harvard. So tell us a little bit about the Harvard case specifically.
So in 2014, a group of Asian Americans sued Harvard University for discriminating against them because racial discrimination is wrong. And Harvard countered. They said, we only do this because we want to have racial diversity, and that's constitutional. And it went to the district court. And the district court ruled in favor of Harvard. They said, yeah, Harvard's discrimination is okay because it's done in the name of diversity. And we kept challenging them. I was a supporter of the lawsuit, and we kept challenging them, to the appeals court level and now to the Supreme Court level. And the Supreme Court recently announced that they were going to seek the Solicitor General's opinion on this case, meaning that the Supreme Court is likely to be interested in taking up this potentially game-changing, altering case that could decide the future of affirmative action, could decide the future of Asian Americans in society, and could decide the future of meritocracy in America today.
Yeah, I want to ask you a little bit more about that idea of meritocracy. Harvard has been discriminating against Asian Americans. That's not up for debate, but Harvard argues that that's defensible, that diversity quotas aid Harvard's education experience. But what does the Harvard case reveal about the extent of discrimination, and why is Harvard really doing this?
So the thing that's often missed is that, to say that Harvard values a diverse student body and that's why they discriminate against Asian Americans, it reveals an implicit truth in how Harvard thinks about Asian Americans. They think of Asian Americans as faceless, monolithic people. They think that if you're an Asian person, or particularly if you're an East Asian or a South Asian person, like a Chinese or Korean or Indian person, that you're basically like a test-taking nerd with no personality. And they use that stereotype against you in the admissions process. How do I know this? Well, I know this because the admissions documents revealed in court that Harvard judges applicants on three things. They judge them on academics, extracurriculars, and personality. And Asian students do the best in academics. They do the best in extracurriculars. But Harvard judges them the worst on the personality score. And among all of the races, and there's no objective evidence to suggest why this would be the case, because Asians do just as well as whites on the alumni interviews. So the only conclusion that we can come to is that Harvard is using the personality score to discriminate against Asian Americans and reinforce ugly stereotypes about them.
That is horrible. And what's crazy, too, is whenever they also mention the idea of the extracurriculars, because we actually know that many Asians are great at extracurriculars. A lot of them do a lot of extracurriculars, especially when applying to college. So that is crazy. But also with the personality that you're mentioning, it seems like a gross generalization if they're really doing this to, a large group of Asians, as if Asians overall have a worse personality. And so do you think this is really just an excuse so that they can, give them a lower rating and not accept them? And if so, why do they want to do that to Asians?
Well, I don't think so. Here's what I know. If you are a second generation Asian American, child of immigrants, the immigrants are still learning American culture. So you come here, maybe your parents are going to teach you to study hard, to work hard, to be academically strong, but you're not exactly going to be able to mingle around the elite cocktail hours right away if your parents aren't skilled at that and don't teach you that right away. So, Asian Americans may be disproportionately less likely to, be able to mingle in the elite liberal progressive circles, but that doesn't mean they're lower personalities, And
you mentioned they do just as well as whites on their interview.
Yeah, and not to mention that when you look at the alumni interview scores, Asians already face barriers just because of the cultural difference to socially assimilate right away into American society. But they work really hard, and to achieve academically and socially. And it turns out they work so hard at that, and they do so well that alumni interviewers rate them just as good as whites. And this is and so they're really basing this personality score really off of no objective evidence.
Right, exactly. Do you personally know people who have been affected by this, who have realized that their SAT scores, their grades, their extracurriculars, even their interview went really well, and yet feel like they were discriminated against as far as getting into a college that matched up with those other things?
Well, I interview several of those kids in my book, An Inconvenient Minority. And, telling you just one quick story, there was a guy in my school, my old school who I interviewed, who was Asian American, and he was one of the smartest people in math in the entire school, probably the top 2 or 3 smartest in math in the entire school. And he worked day and night just slaving away and at math and doing really well, and he took Princeton University graduate courses, and he pushed himself really hard, and his alumni interview went well according to him, everything like that. He had excellent SAT scores, excellent grades, just objectively excellent. But then, he got rejected by Princeton, which practices the same sort of Ivy League and, discrimination that Harvard and Yale does. And I interviewed him about this, and, he got bitter about this. He became bitter about this because he blamed it on himself. He blamed it on himself. And one of the reasons why I wrote this book was because I wanted to tell the truth to Asian Americans. And the predominant reaction that I get from Asian Americans who I tell the truth about Harvard's discrimination to is relief. It's relief because so many of these kids work so hard to get into the college that would provide them these kinds of things. And when they don't get in, they blame it on themselves. And it just makes the competition and stress culture even worse for these people. And you have to realize, and these Asian Americans who I care about deeply have to realize that it's not on them. It's because these colleges don't want people like them. And I think that that's a truth that needs to be expressed.
Yes, and it's horrible. It's horrible that we can't reward people based on their merit and based on their hard work. But I think it also shows that even if someone, let's say, has this hard work ethic and really applies themselves, but doesn't go to, let's say, an Ivy League school, they can still be very successful in life, but that doesn't justify the discrimination against them that these schools are doing. It doesn't mean it's an excuse. But a hard work ethic can still serve them, because we've even seen with many who get into these colleges solely based on affirmative action, they oftentimes don't succeed afterwards, and they don't actually really fully benefit from the education experience there. But I want to ask you a little bit about the Supreme Court. If the Supreme Court takes this case and says you can't discriminate against Asians, what will be the ramification of that decision?
Well, if the Supreme Court doesn't take up this case, what it will be saying, it's going to preserve the old diversity precedent. So in a series of Supreme Court cases before this one, the Supreme Court, typically we're supposed to live in a country where there shouldn't be legalized racial discrimination, right? But the Supreme Court has made one exception consistently over and over again in cases, and that is the case of college admissions. Colleges are allowed to use race in their admissions process for the purposes of diversity. That's how the Supreme Court justifies it. So they're giving a loophole for elite colleges and universities to be able to say, we just don't want to admit too many Asians or too many white people or too many people of X race because we want diversity. And so this whole diversity justification has become a sort of catch-all term that all of these elite colleges and elite corporations use to justify them unfairly and unconstitutionally admitting, hiring, and promoting people on the basis of race.
And it's so crazy because it's not actual diversity. It's only diversity of skin color. It's not diversity of thought, which would actually maybe enrich more of a college experience. And some of these arguments that they're making act as if it's diversity of thought, but it's not. It's just diversity of skin color. But I want to ask you a little bit about these tech companies, because you've written about that recently. And I want to ask you, what is kind of the hidden atmosphere at a lot of these tech companies like Facebook and Google? How do they treat a lot of their Asian American workers who are very smart, very successful? It doesn't seem like they give them the attention they deserve, and instead really kind of elevate more Black and Hispanic voices. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, so Google and Facebook, these big tech Silicon Valley companies, they have to hire Asians because Asian Americans disproportionately make up the top qualified software engineers, in the entire country and in the entire world. And so as a result, 9 out of 10 Google and Facebook software engineers are Asians. Not just Asian Americans, but Asians, like straight from China or India. And so they have to hire Asians. But it's clear that Asians do not belong in their so-called diversity and inclusion framework. Because, Google and Facebook and nearly every Fortune 500 company now has this race-based framework called diversity and inclusion, where they want to hire and elevate people of certain races. And in all of Google and Facebook's documents, the races that they specifically want to hire, promote, and elevate are Black and Latino. They never mention Asians. And so they want to give black, and they even call black Americans in these corporations, they call them black plus, because it suggests that they deserve a plus factor just solely for being black in these hiring companies. And I don't believe that your race should give you a plus or minus factor, no matter which race you are. And so, but as a result, because the culture and the voice is, on the side of, unfairly promoting people on the basis of their race, Asian Americans tend to get depressed in these in Google and Facebook's diversity and inclusion programs. And as a result, they're unfairly put to the back and ignored, when in fact they make up the predominant backbone of these companies and allow these companies to make the profits that they do.
That is terrible. And it really is just so embarrassing for companies like Google and Facebook, because they claim to be for minorities. They claim to be doing all of these initiatives, but in reality, they actually aren't even showing that the people who even work on these things.